The first Dalek story had accidentally created a phenomenon, and had turned Doctor Who from an interesting gamble into an overnight success. The fact that the show overwhelmingly demonstrated it had legs beyond the Daleks was to its credit, and is just as much a reason why it has endured as the initial Dalek success, but the temptation to go back to the well and do the Daleks again was to have been pretty irresistible. And thus Nation was duly commissioned for this story, the last to be filmed in Doctor Who's first production block, and to be the second story of its second season. The Dalek Invasion of Earth was a result, and while, as we'll see, it was not an unqualified success dramatically, it solidified the success of the Dalek phenomenon and reinforced Dalek mania. It also was a clear sign of how far the show had come in such a short time. While the first story was entirely studio-bound, using what were only a few sets made more impressive than they really were by talented production designers, this story had extensive location filming, just showing how wide the scale for Doctor Who now was. The success of the Daleks meant we can now see them in Trafalgar Square just as much in the studio sets. Doctor Who had come of age, perhaps. Now, this story is a flawed one, but I think the reason it's remembered as a classic despite having several gaping holes in it is precisely because it's the moment that Doctor Who took the leap to become the long-running series it is today. The first extensive use of location filming was a big symbolic step, but just as importantly was the very idea of returning enemies. It was a demonstration that the show would have legs, that it was going to have the hooks for viewers to come back for some time. That's not to underscore how important the Daleks themselves were to this equation, though. There's no point in having returning villains if those villains were unable to grab the audience. Indeed, if you discount the Monk, the next time there'd be a story with a returning villain would be The Moonbase, which was the second story of the Cybermen, by which point the entire cast had been changed. One should not discount how important this occasion was, a sign the Daleks was something special. In its way, therefore, this was the moment Doctor Who changed. It was the moment it established its sense of scope and achievement, and also decided what it wanted to be in terms of its longevity. But that's quite enough waxing lyrical bollocks. Let's actually have a look at this story, because despite all of that, there's no doubt this is a deeply flawed story, specifically that the plot is quite weak and the pacing is very off at times. And yet it's still fondly remembered on its merits. And these merits are considerable, so it's a bit of a balancing act. Let's see, shall we? To begin with, this story was directed by Richard Martin, who, as I'd mentioned then, was one of the directors of the first Dalek story, and whose episodes I mentioned were generally weaker than those directed by Christopher Barry. Here he does all 6, and the job he does is mixed. Some of it is a bit messy, a lot of the action sequences don't really work, and quite a lot of the middle of the story is honestly pretty sedate. Part of it is that the script isn't really giving everyone much to do, but I really did find myself losing interest as Susan and David buggered about with crocodiles, for instance, just because it's done in a very pedestrian manner. Again, part of this is the script and we'll get to it, but even so. There are ways to elevate boring bits of scripts, and Martin just doesn't really manage it. However, he does make up for this in one very important way, the location filming. Martin milks every single penny out of it, and the result shows just how much potential it had for Doctor Who. This not only gives the story an enormous scope, running through London like this gives the feeling of enormity of this invasion, an occupation that would be very, very difficult to achieve in the studio, but it's also a way of showing off the themes of occupation that are so vital to the script. Daleks on Westminster Bridge is probably the second most iconic image of alien invasion in Doctor Who, only beaten by the Cybermen at St Paul's, and these shots have exactly the right feel to them. Another great example is the work camp, where the use of wide shots really make it seem like this is an enormous operation. It's quite cleverly done in that regard. Another positive thing he does is how he shoots the Daleks. They're frequently shot from below in order to increase their menace, and this works in making them feel like a genuine threat. This can be quite subtle. The shot of them in Battersea Park you can now see is a great example of that. Even when this isn't done, he films the Daleks well. A favourite shot of mine is when Barbara and Jenny are betrayed by the women in the wood and captured by a Dalek. That Dalek's sudden appearance in the doorway is a sudden shock, and brilliantly conveys the dread of the moment. Unfortunately, this is undermined a few times, such as when driving a big truck at them knocks them over, which is a bit anticlimactic, but that was in the script, so not really Martin's fault. Overall, I'd say the job he does is a good one, but there was a lot of room for improvement. Tightening up a few bits and preventing the pacing from collapsing through the middle of the story might have helped. As for our production elements, some worked, some don't. The soundtrack is excellent and really adds to the atmosphere. The scene with the most prominent location shooting when Barbara and Jenny push German City in his wheelchair through London wouldn't be half as tense as it would be without the score. It's simple yet effective, and drives in the feeling this is supposed to convey. Just travelling through central London, something done every day by many viewers at the time, has now become an alien and dangerous thing. The soundtrack is a major contributor to how this feeling being successfully conveyed. Unfortunately, the production designers don't quite live up to the standards they achieved in the first story. Nothing really stands out, and I don't think the Dalek spaceship is all that great. It's just a bit too generic after my liking. Which is a shame given how good it was in that first story, as I said. Still, not actively bad or anything, just a bit bland. Of course, one must not forget the biggest failure of this story, and that's the Sliver. Why anyone thought this was a good idea is beyond me, but this thing looks ridiculous, and is about as threatening as a particularly vicious pimple. Sometimes you shouldn't let your ambition outgrow your reach. Richard Martin, of course, found this out to his peril in the Web Planet, but I'm not really sure what else can be said about the Sliver. This thing is pointless to the plot and looks shit. I do try not to judge Classic Who on its effects, because it's priced into what you're going to get, it's going to be dodgy, but it goes beyond dodgy into what the fuck were they thinking. Nothing much on making that thing, that's for fucking sure. Also, this is kind of a small thing, but the voices of the Daleks are noticeably not as good as they were in the first story, and indeed would be for the rest of the 60s. There's a story about how they never wrote down the modulation, just winged it every time, but given the voices are pretty consistent for the rest of the decade, I'm not sure how accurate that really is. Point is, they don't sound great here. In this particular bit,
we are the masters of Earth. We are the masters of Earth. We are the masters of Earth.
Are you really? How interesting. Yeah, it could have been better. So, with a bit of production I'm talking out of my arse about out of the way, let's get to the bit where there's a semblance of a feeling I know what the hell I'm talking about. The script. Of course, written by one Mr. Terence Joseph Nation. Obviously, having created them in the first place, bringing them back was going to be his job, and he does quite a lot right in doing so, building on and expanding the themes of the original story while expanding the scope of the Daleks and really creating the form they're known today. It's also got some incredibly rich world building that really contributes to the atmosphere of the piece. He also builds on the biggest strength of the script in the first story, that of character, and particularly those of the four regulars. However, before we do get to that good stuff, we do have to look at a few minor flaws in the script, namely that the plot is really weak, with three main glaring issues that contribute to this. The first is that particularly towards the middle of the story, it just kind of slows down a lot, and there are long stretches of not really much happening. About 2 or 3 episodes in the middle of the story are basically spent by our heroes trying to get to where they want to go, which does get pretty tired quickly. Barabba grows with Jenny in German City, and the latter story does keep it interesting for a while, but once he's been deaded, there's about an episode where they have a boring truck drive before anything actually interesting happens. Ian, meanwhile, is sodding about in a flying saucer, while the Doctor and Susan are sitting about in London for a while and occasionally coming across some crocodiles. Oh, yeah, and because William Hartnell hurt his back, the Doctor isn't even in episode 4, which means it's even more lifeless. I'm particularly irritated about this because it's surrounded by a lot of good stuff. We'll get to most of this in more detail later on, of course. But in Barbara's case, for instance, the stuff with German City and then the short stuff with the women in the woods, that's all good stuff that plays into the overall themes of the piece. It's just between that it's total dead air. Susan and David's relationship and how that grows, again, we'll get to it later, but it works well, but it's still surrounded by buggering about in the sewers. Even then, though, it's interjected by good stuff, which we'll get to, but it just means it's a tricky thing to look at, that's all. The finale also loses a lot of steam as well. The character stuff that had worked so well throughout episodes 5 and 6 sort of grinds to a halt towards the end of the latter, and it just becomes characters do things to save day. It's just a bit sedate and technical, there's no real sense of tension or achievement, just that we managed to do these various tasks and that ended up working. Hooray! I wish it was a bit more thought out and enticing than it was. A final example I'll give is early on in the story. There's a solid 5 minutes or so spent on the Doctor and Ian doing some logic puzzle in the Dalek spaceship, which is duller than dishwater and all for a silly premise, which we'll get to. A story like this needed the tension to be maintained throughout, and moments like this just kill it stone dead. This was an issue in the first story as well, as we saw with the cave stuff, and it's unfortunate that both the first 2 stories have so much dead air wasted when there's so much great stuff surrounding it. Maybe the issue is simply there wasn't enough plot to fill out 6 episodes, but to be honest, I'm becoming less and less amenable to that argument as time goes on. You, as a writer, have been given a set number of episodes to fill. If your plot can't fill that out, you need to change your plot or add on new stuff to it. Just adding what's essentially just padding shouldn't be a solution. It's entirely understandable why this has ended up being the case, time pressures are a thing, but it's a shame that a lot of the story just feels like it's chugging along, not actually achieving anything. Problem number 2 is a number of silly gaps in the plot that do just seem like carelessness, unfortunately. It's one of Nation's issues as a writer that his approach to plotting is sometimes a bit haphazard. It's going to become a bit of a theme that he's a very, very good ideas man, but putting that together in a coherent story where all the beats match is something that seems to be a bit harder for him. This is a phenomenon I'm going to talk about in greater detail in later stories, so I won't dwell on it too much. But I will say that the fact that his best regarded story is probably Genesis of the Daleks, where he had a script editor like Robert Holmes cleaning up after him, is probably not a coincidence. There are plenty of examples in this story. For instance, the Daleks decide to firebomb London because they don't need it anymore, which does kind of rather beg the question of why they need it in the first place, given all their slave labours up in Bedfordshire, but that's not even the main point. Okay, before we get to the main point, a Dalek decides to ask an extraordinarily stupid question.
Supreme Command have given orders for London to be destroyed by fire bombs. Do you intend to stay here in the city?
Yes, I want to get firebombed. Of course I don't intend to stay, you stupid moron. But apart from that, they deliver this as one ridiculously tiny wee bomb with an over-the-top ticking noise that David, of all people, not noted as being a weapons expert, manages to defuse with the contents of his arse. Now, granted, this was almost certainly meant to be the Doctor, and they had to change it when Hartnell buggered his back, but even so, it's just the kind of silly, pointless plotting that undermines this story. Now, to me, it seems logical to leave the Robo-Man there to avoid the bomb being tampered with, and it's not as if the Daleks would be worried about them being killed in the blast or anything. And also, it's kind of ridiculous to expect this one firebomb about the size of a suitcase to destroy all of London. Which is doubly weird, because I'm pretty sure the dialogue earlier mentions firebombs plural, but in the end they decided to go with just the one. The worst thing is, though, this never matters again. If they tried a firebomb, it failed, oh well, that's the end of it. The story progresses as if this never happened, and they never bothered in the first place, and absolutely nothing would have changed. Talk about dead air, this is a perfect example. Even if Hartnell was available to have the Doctor do it, it wouldn't have added anything to his character or anything. We already know he's intelligent, so this is just a waste. Another example, the Robo-Men are a good addition overall, but part of the early part of the story relies on there being a great intelligence test needed to be passed to be selected to become one. Remember the boring logic test I was yapping on about? Yeah, that. And my question is, why? Why would there need to be great intelligence to become a mindless drone entirely reliant on orders? What possible intelligence is needed for that? Surely it would be better just to use unintelligent people, as they'd be less likely to outthink the conditioning or something. It's just a massive bit of logical plotting designed to basically lift up some dull plot hooks in those first 2 or 3 episodes. There are other examples, but importantly I think this leads us on to point 3, which is the central point of the story is so stupid, really astonishingly stupid. The Daleks' big plan is to dig a massive hole in Bedfordshire, causing untold amounts of improvements, so they can drop a technobabble MacGuffin to the centre of the Earth and use it to replace the magnetic core of the planet so they can fly it around the universe. Yeah, I don't know anything about science, but I can tell you for free that's complete and total bollocks, and what's worse, it's bollocks that sounds just as insane as it actually is. Inserting Ed Wood plots into Doctor Who, for me, takes the charming silliness we usually get with Doctor Who plots and turns it into, well, just really B-movie territory. And Doctor Who, to me at least, isn't really that. It's better than that, usually. In a moment, we're going to go through why the serious and mature themes of the story are one of its best features, and I would hate it if my appreciation of this was in any way lessened by this utterly ridiculous main plot. It's not, but the point is, it could have done. It's the kind of plot you'd expect in New Who, except even Stephen Moffat would probably stop and decide that's too stupid for him. Probably. In any case, it's not what I expect or want from classic Who. It's usually better than this. Finally, I should mention there are some bits of weak dialogue. For instance, at the beginning of episode 2, as the Dalek appears, Ian makes a pretty stupid comment.
Why have the human beings been allowed to get so near the river? Doctor, that voice.
Yes, the voice. Surely the look of the Dalek should have made it cotton onto this is in fact a Dalek? Did he think it was just a bloke in a Dalek costume or something? Anyway, that's enough whinging from me. Let's see what the story does well, and the answer is quite a lot. Firstly, the key feature of the story is that it depicts an Earth, and specifically to the story itself and the viewers at the time, a Britain under occupation. This is a big success in 2 important ways: world building and themes. In terms of world building, this is a richly developed world, one that feels developed naturally. While the main backstory is told during exposition, it's made better by the clever choice to have it from 2 points of view at once, being told to both the Doctor and Ian, and Barbara and Susan simultaneously. I won't go into the details, but the way it's told avoids this just becoming a simple alien invasion tale, and adds a great deal of depth to it. It becomes believable that this society as it evolved in the way it did. It also adds to the character interpretations and thematic stuff as well. These people have never known anything except despair and hopelessness, first from plague, and then from the invasion. And getting it from 2 viewpoints reinforces the universality of this experience. It also means that despite much of it being dull dead air, all the plot generally comes together in terms of adding to this world. The crocodiles, or it might have been alligators, I forget, I'm not checking, escaped from the zoo when they couldn't be maintained anymore. The vehicles in the museum were just ignored as having no worth for Daleks, etc. This is added to through dialogue, for instance. The man who's going down to try and escape to Cornwall, as there are a few Daleks down there, showing the first hand accounts of the world beyond what we see on the screen. All of this combines brilliantly to make the world feel richer and much larger. More importantly, though, is the thematic basis of the story. Just as the first Dalek story used the Daleks as an allegory for the Nazis, this story also uses the Third Reich as its inspiration. Only this time, it presents the great what-if of the Second World War, asking the question, what if the Nazis won? What this story is presenting is a vision of Britain under occupation, of Daleks doing their mock Nazi salutes with their plungers while patrolling the streets of London. For the parents watching back in 1964, it would have been an uncomfortably familiar fear, given how close it would have felt in 1940-41. Of course, we now know there was a pretty good reason the Nazis never attempted invading Britain, because all the evidence points to the fact it would have been a complete and utter disaster for them, and that's even if they had managed to destroy the RAF in the Battle of Britain, which they didn't. But that doesn't discount how real the fear of it was, and just how the first story played into the generic fear of the Nazis from the war. This one playing into the very material and real fear felt by the British population during the war was a very, very good move. This is doubly effective because of how well it portrays the possibility of a life under occupation and what that would have meant for Britain. This involves the portrayal of occupation and resistance. The slave workers in Bedfordshire would no doubt have been an uncomfortable reminder of the practices of the Third Reich, and in this particular instance I refrain from making a Bedfordshire joke as I did earlier. But the reason it's so effective is not so much the direct comparisons, but instead the implications it makes about what an occupied Britain may have been like. For instance, the women in the wood who betray Barbara and Jenny to the Daleks, they're an uncomfortable reminder that not everyone can be noble. Desperation can lead people to betray their own if it thinks it improves their chances at survival. One only has to think of what happened to French collaborators after the war to realise how strong the emotions can be for this sort of thing. Equally, there's the bit about the black marketeer. Those women were broken by desperation, but some see misery as an opportunity. As David puts it to Susan at one point, not all humans are automatically allies, some pursue survival at all cost. Potently, there's another story, that of Larry, Ian's buddy throughout most of the story, who's looking for his brother, only to find him in episode 5 as a Robo-Man. This is a very grim scene, perhaps one of the grimmest of the 60s, but it's also exceptionally well done. Larry pleads with his brother, tries to get him to remember his wife, but to no avail. In the end, Larry and his brother kill each other. Larry is shot, but he manages to strangle his brother so Ian can escape. It's a shockingly tragic moment, and one that demonstrates that occupation has torn this family apart, one that was no doubt repeated all across the Dalek invasion, and one that no doubt would have been repeated had the Nazis actually invaded Britain. For someone who was basically just a side character for Ian to exposit at, it's astonishing how much thought was put into this storyline, and the results are excellent. This theme also plays into the way the guest characters are portrayed. German City is obviously so taken by desperation and clinging to hope that doesn't really exist, that he continually tinkers with his shit bombs that don't work, even in the end giving his life so he can try and prove they work, or portraying how an intelligent man of science can be driven to desperation, and in the end death. There's Tyler, no, not that one, or that one. Oh, come on! Yes, there we are. His character is basically one of someone whose spirit has been completely crushed by the death and destruction he's seen, to the point where he doesn't make friends and abruptly pushes everyone else away. And yet Susan makes the observation that he's only pretending not to care, that no matter how hard he tries, he can't truly shut himself off. It's therefore fitting that the Doctor tells him that he's the perfect man to rebuild the society at the end of the story. This is all fantastically done, and effectively shows the occupation through the human experience in a way that's really quite mature. Even separate from the thematic stuff, the guest characters were a weakness in the first Dalek story that's been shored up here. They're much better and far more three-dimensional. Even those who don't really play into the themes like Jenny or David, nevertheless feel like real people because time is taken to develop them, and that's mostly through their interactions with the regulars. For instance, Tyler, because of what I discussed a moment ago, comes across as, well, exactly what he's meant to be, seasoned with experience, but aloof and ruthless, which requires the Doctor at one point to prevent him from killing a Robo-Man just because he can. Whereas the Fowls from the first story, that was the cowardly one, I think. That's about what I can remember. So, yeah, that's a weakness that's definitely been addressed here. Of course, I'd argue the most important supporting character of the lot is David, but that's for another reason that we'll go into in a moment, because now it's time to talk about a strength Nation demonstrated the first time around, and also again the second time, the characterisation of our regulars. It struck me when watching the first episode of just how good it actually was. It's immediately apparent how far they've come and how far they've developed from their interactions. The Doctor's happy as it is possible Ian and Barbara have come home, and as they discuss and work things out, it's shown that the Doctor and Ian now trust each other's judgment. Their relationship might not be perfect, but the antagonism is long gone, aside from a few moments of the First Doctor being the First Doctor, such as reminding Ian he's not half-wit. It's clear that they're no longer enemies, they're now friends. The rest of the story also see the characters get plenty of great stuff as well. The best bit for the Doctor is the bit I mentioned before, when he prevents Tyler from shooting a Robo-Man.
No, Tyler, no, I never take life, only when my own is immediately threatened.
Which, I think, is a great summing up of his philosophy. Far better than I never would or any of that bullshit from New Who. And also I think it's a clear sign of how well the character had been developed, given it took Ian from stopping him bashing in a caveman's brain in the first ever story, leading to this. Although, in his defence, those cavemen pissed me off. Ian and Barbara both get to show off their abilities and resourcefulness by showing they've come just as far as the Doctor has in terms of their characters. They come from being the fish out of water school teachers to being able to take command of situations as dire as this one. There's nothing too out of the usual routine for them, it's not really their story, but they certainly prove their worth, and showed why having regular characters which I mentioned was so important for the longevity of the series. And then we have Susan. Susan does not begin the story endearing herself to us by twisting her ankle like an idiot, which does not help the perceptions of the character, it's fair to say. The thing is, Carole and Ford wanted out, and they were more than happy to oblige her, as it's pretty obvious they just had absolutely no idea what to do with the character. So she just sort of became the screaming one, and that was about it. She had her moments, but unlike with the other three, there was no clear path for the character, and that was probably part of the reason Ford wanted to leave. But this was the first time a main character was being written out, so obviously it was not going to be immediately apparent what to do with it. It is easy in light of how Classic Who frequently decided to have characters randomly leave after about 5 minutes deliberation, and much of that time it was after they were falling in love, just as is the case here, so it's easy to dismiss Susan's departure here along those lines. It's not along those lines, though. And the reason for that is early on, around the beginning of episode 3, she's paired up with David for the rest of the story, and this allows the relationship to start growing. Early on, their differences are made clear as Susan expresses her desire to leave, while David refuses to consider it. It's his world and he's going to fight for it. This demonstrates how used to her lifestyle Susan has become, that she's basically just wandering around without somewhere to truly be, and it takes the interactions with David to make her realise this. It's mostly subtle stuff throughout the rest of the story, with the two of them growing more comfortable with each other, but the fact alone that so much time is spent on this relationship allows the conclusion of the story to be believable. Equally is the fact that for so much of the time the Doctor is spent in close proximity to the two of them, to be able to see what's happening and to be able to steel himself for the decision he doesn't want to make, but knows he has to. This leads to the last 5 minutes or so of episode 6, which are the best of the story and frankly some of the best stuff from the entire decade of the show. The Doctor and Susan have a last conversation where they just, talk about normal things really, as they always did, but there's an undercurrent to it, and full credit goes to William Hartnell here for portraying this as effortlessly as he does. But the Doctor knows it's the end. He's been seeing what's happening, he nearly called them making out earlier for Christ's sake, and he can't stand in the way of that despite his own feelings. There's a subtle melancholy to this, something that was usually absent from his conversations with Susan, and it's obvious why. Susan and David then speak, and here it calls back to their earlier conversation that I spoke about. She's got the opportunity here to have a time and place of her own, to be more than just a wanderer. But she's not able to make that decision for herself, the Doctor has to make it for her. This shot in particular is a favourite of mine from this scene, the Doctor solemnly making the decision to leave behind the only member of his family he has left, knowing it's the only real choice for her. She's not like him, she can't wander forever. And Ian and Barbara are looking on, solemn as the Doctor is, but knowing this is something they can't interfere in, whatever their feelings about Susan, that this is the Doctor and Susan's decision to make. And then of course the speech we all know, explaining why he's doing it and that he'll come back, not that he ever has on TV of course. We all know it, Hartnell is masterful as he delivers it. This scene is not only an emotional gut punch, it also plays into how the character of the Doctor has evolved. He's gone from deciding to risk all of their lives to fulfill his curiosity in the first Dalek story, to now in this second one deciding to let go of what matters most to him to make sure she has the happy life she needs. Yeah, these last 5 minutes of episode 6, they're pretty much flawless, some of the best stuff in the 60s, and it really set the template for how good companion departures are to be done. So, before we finish up, let's discuss the one part of the story I haven't actually spoken about all that much, the Daleks themselves, because despite this sort of being the quintessential Dalek Mania story, honestly they're kind of among the least interesting parts of the story, especially when compared to the thematic and character work. I'll say that there is a lot that feels weak about them. Their initial appearance is pretty crap. Why would it be in the Thames? I've already mentioned the voices being a bit off, and they don't really do that much. I mean, they shoot a lot of people and they, take their place as the occupying army, but apart from that, the interesting bits of the story are focused on the people on the piece, not them. On the other hand though, the bits when they are shown to be the occupiers work very well, the bits in London particularly as I talked about earlier. I do find it amusing how Nation also tried to tie up the whole thing about them all dying at the end of the first story by saying this is an earlier point in the Daleks' history, which makes even less sense than just saying they didn't die actually. But in any case, this can't be the case because the files and planet of the Daleks refer to the story, so that's score 1 for continuity. I think, maybe. I'll give the Daleks this in this story. They do come across as a credible threat, and you can believe the fear the people in the story have of them. They're obviously in total control, and that results in their seeming invincibility. Early on, they broadcast an ultimatum that ends with "Daleks offer you life," a phrase that portrays just how fucked the situation really is. Not only because they demonstrably do not, but also because it shows how entrenched their position is. The only hope appears to be surrender. So yeah, that does work. Generally, they do have a bit of menace to them. It's just, a bit odd how, despite this being the great Dalek 60s classic, they don't actually really do that much, but never mind. Being a bit threatening is more than enough. There are plenty of stories later on where they can't even manage that or get even close to it, so we'll take what we can get. Anything else? Nope? Oh, good. So, bearing in mind this final score is a measure of how the story measures against the rest of Classic Who and nothing else, the final score for the Dalek Invasion of Earth is 6 out of 10. Like the first Dalek story, slightly above average for Classic Who. It does unfortunately feel like someone took it out of the oven a bit before it was done. The plot is extremely flimsy and it wanders throughout much of the story. It feels as if it needed tightening up a bit. But it does make up for it with some excellent thematic and character work, a wonderful ending for Susan, and a general sense of scale and scope, a sign for Doctor Who was moving out of its infancy. So while it's not perfect, it's a worthwhile story and one that very much has its place in the history books of Doctor Who.